I should go? All right. So welcome. Thanks very much for attending this session. My name is Avi Rembaum. I'm Vice President Security Solutions for Checkpoint Software. We're a really big network security company. Before I start out, just a quick question. Who in this room is in an actual hands-on technical role for security-related stuff? 2, 3, okay, 4, great, all right. With this session, what I'm going to try to do is put a little bit of a philosophical context around technical topics. Going to take a look at some of the bigger issues surrounding Internet of Things and some of the implications across the broader IT industry for IoT. Will do my absolute best, even though I work for a product vendor, not to talk our products. I hope that's okay. If there are questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt. There is audio and video in the presentation. I specifically put it at the right points when you might be tending to sleep. So that's meant to kind of wake you up and make sure we're all kind of engaged. I was instructed not to walk around, which I do tend to do, but since my bag is right here, I probably would have tripped over it anyway. So with that, let's sort of get going. So it's the title of the session is IoT Winter of Things, Is It Coming? All right. What I kind of want to start out with is perhaps try to get a better idea of what IoT winter could potentially be. And yes, this does kind of take a look at the Game of Thrones, winter is coming, like the end of the world is near. In fact, the end of the world has always been here kind of a thing. So if the cultural reference to Game of Thrones doesn't make any sense, then that's your problem, not mine. Plus also beyond that, there is no graphical tie-in to Game of Thrones, and that's because for copyright restrictions, I would be shot. So we're going to enter at that. So to kind of take a look at, for those of us who are here in the New York area, might remember as of at least 3 weeks ago what winter felt like. So if we didn't live in New York, but if we were somewhere closer to the equator in a warmer climate, winter isn't necessarily such a bad thing, right? So that's sort of sitting on the beach in Maui in January, kind of rather enjoying life, not so bad. For those of us who are in technical capacities, that is never our days. Right, sort of totally anathema to anything that we understand to be reality. So kind of as a general working rule, those of us who live in warmer climates and go on ski vacations or just like to hang out in Times Square when the snow first starts to fall might like the rather pleasant context of winter where it starts to snow and everything is fantastic and it looks really, really pretty. And those who happen to work right near the intersection of 42nd and 5th in the middle of February will probably relate to something more like that view of Internet of Things. And for the most part, the best way to describe winter on a day like that is that it's just shit. And we'll kind of leave it at that. All right? And so that, I think, probably does more closely align to what we might be looking at in terms of what an IoT winter could potentially be. Right? But then there's different elements to that. So to really get an understanding of what an IoT winter would be, first question, of course, is, well, what is IoT? Right, what is actually involved in the concept of Internet of Things. And then the second question would then take a look at what a realistic forecast would be. I am not a weather person. I took one class on astronomy when I was in college, and my astronomy professor in college decided that the right way to explain anything geo-related was to stand in the front of the lecture hall, explain that he had much more mass than anyone in the classroom did, and if that were the context of astrophysics, we would all be stuck in his belly. And with that, it sort of began, right? So there will be no realistic forecast models presented, kind of just some general context. To start out with what isn't necessarily the newest survey, and there are sufficient research reports that would show this as being about a 10% view, there absolutely is a pickup across all surveys associated with connected devices. And at its most basic, sort of the standard running definition of what Internet of Things would be is a ton of connected machines. There are sufficient surveys that speak to closer to 1 trillion connected devices. The Forbes study looks to closer towards 100 billion, which is a lot. I did a count recently on my now end-of-life Apple Wi-Fi devices inside my house, and I think at any given point in time, with 3 children, my wife, and me, we probably have 50 connected devices at any point in time running consistently. Is that sort of, if you had to guess, what your situation would be in your homes? Right? So there's a lot. multiply that by 8 billion people. Okay, so my math on that one shows what, 5 times 8 is 40. Add another 0 on top of that, we're at 400 billion, just if we assume everyone's home is like mine, which it probably isn't. Okay, but that's sort of a general starting point for what this sort of thing could be. Now, I'm a big fan of the New York Times. I don't know if anyone here is or isn't, but that's all good. They did have this fascinating study early at the beginning of the year, and it was an article about a health clinic. It was a cancer ward, and this very bizarre behavior that they started to witness in a cat. Right? So doctors working at this cancer ward noticed after a while that this one cat had this tendency to hop on a bed and sort of scurry up next and start purring and lying very beautifully with the person in the ward who was going to die that day. Okay, all right, so when I first started reading that story, I knew there was a reason why I hated cats, right? Kind of put that out there. So that sort of was lesson number one. But then lesson number two was it kind of introduced then the question of, well, what did the cat sense? What was going on with the cat? Was there some kind of innate capability of a cat to sense changes deep into the human body or into the soul, heaven forbid, that might allude to pending death? So at this hospital, they started to take a look at some of the precursors of diagnostics, taking a look at micro changes in certain things that they weren't necessarily investigating before. They also started to take a step back and take a look at some of the medicines they were prescribing and the reasons why and what some of the initial test data was starting to show. And then they plugged all that stuff into a neural network and let the computer start to learn about what the data were suggesting. And what they very quickly found was that indeed this neural network connected system was able to come to predictions about lifespan much better than doctors who've gone through years of training and had spent tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on their own lives, of their own money, on very specific study. And that the computers could, within a pretty good level of accuracy, come to an understanding of how long a person had left in their life based on the data they were looking at. All right? So as they looked at this information, one of the main lessons that the researchers who were covered in the article came to was that their level of depression after being cancer physicians started to skyrocket. Because even with all this study, there was such a limit to their capacity that they understood that they were in many ways useless as far as what their fundamental responsibility was. Computers were able to reach conclusions about their patients who they had been treating for months or years far faster than they could and far more accurately than they would with their level of knowledge. So if we think about what that means for us as humans in our society, take the cat scariness away, in and of itself is a pretty scary reality. There are sufficient studies out there that speak to the possibility that many of us in this room will find ourselves unemployed because the Internet of Things and neural networks and artificial intelligence will demonstrate that computers can do a lot of things better than we can and much faster. There was a headline in the papers this morning, I forget which one exactly, that talked about, I think it was 2 million Wall Street jobs that are going to be gone over the next few years once artificial intelligence starts to kick in, and that banks will be much more profitable as a result. Okay, so that's sort of thing number one. There's another study that points to about 50% of all jobs gone. Just gone, right? Which leads to a whole bunch of other questions about the level of political stability we could all experience and what that would mean for our day-to-day lives. It also means we could all go back to that wonderful view of Maui in January, and that'll be every single day. And if computers make our lives perfect, then who really cares? Right? So there's a lot of thought wrapped into the whole Internet of Things discussion that is a far bigger story than just blinking lights and technologies. So we have this situation, right? We've got these millions of connected devices, and that combines with a nearly limitless quantity of storage and compute. Cisco had this fantastic view a few years ago of what it would mean when things really went cloud. And their view, what they envisioned was basically a stock market that allowed people to trade on the futures of compute. Compute became a commodity like corn. And if you wanted to understand what you'd be paying for, it would be based on whatever the market had in terms of potential future capacity, and you could buy access to it like Southwest does with fuel and windows that crack very easily with braking engines. Okay? Right, so that's sort of what this type of a future might in fact see. And those of us who have the opportunity to, at least as a few months ago, walk into Whole Foods and not find anything on the shelves, would also understand, right, how amazing it could be for us as people just going through our day-to-day lives. Right, imagine that situation where, on the one hand, if you worked at a retail company, so who here works at a company that is in the business of selling stuff to people and consumers? Okay, 1, 2, 3, sort of. Okay, fantastic, right? So those of us who do kind of go through that as our day-to-day lives probably can start to understand what it would mean for Avi to walk into a store, and hi, by the way, I'm Avi, and the preference of my shopping would be predetermined based on my previous experience of working and buying with this specific store. The specific items that I was going to be picking up had already been pre-delivered based on my future expectations that somehow they know, and also based on the history of my purchasing over the past few years. The truck would have already delivered this stuff because it knew in advance exactly what item had to be there. Right? All that kind of stuff is based on pre-calculations, based on neural networks and a whole load of systems that are going to be plucking from my buying power and my purchasing experience and my characteristics and my credit history and the amount of money I spend on my mortgage every month, where my kids go to school, every possible characteristic. And somehow weather patterns will also kick in and the trucks will drive themselves and everything will be seamless and perfect. Okay? Right, so that's in some ways what this fantastic reality could look like, unless there's absolutely nothing on the shelves and everyone gets run over when the trucks drive themselves. Right? So we kind of have this crazy possibility that we're looking at. Now, that's great, and it really could be absolutely amazing, unless I decide to go vegan, and after 3 months of buying meat, the only thing I'm presented with is like prime cuts of steak. That wouldn't be good. But within this context, we then need to ask ourselves, well, there's this terrible cybercrime community that's out there. It loves to play around. We experienced the session before, for those who were in this room, about hackback possibilities and what the creativeness of the hacking community actually has. Right? So if we think about that level of creativity, that level of maliciousness, start considering organized crime, start considering nation-state attacks if you're a part of a boycotted state and your only way of making money is to run ransomware campaigns, how could that start to make its way into this whole effort? Stories about countries having the capacity to take down power grids like that. Think about NotPetya and the power systems, and in fact most government systems of countries in Eastern Europe being taken offline completely. So when you start to weave that narrative into this crazy future of Internet of Things, but then we start to consider, well, the possibility of a Internet of Things future, bless you, not necessarily being all that fantastic. Right? And so maybe as sort of an initial step back, let's consider, if we think about all these connected devices, are we aware of any recent stories where the embedded systems of nearly every single computing platform we touch in a given day might have vulnerabilities that can be used to steal nearly everything that we know or do? Okay? Right? So as a basic question, for those who are involved in the IT space, have you finally resolved all of the vulnerabilities that you have that are associated with Spectre and Meltdown? You're not going to raise your hand, but the answer is absolutely not. Okay? And those who have not raised their hand, how many of you are actually still dealing with WannaCry from nearly a year ago? Right? There you go. And how many of you are still dealing with Conficker from 6 years ago? Also all the same. And who here is actually able to track across their networks the extent to which exploits from 6, 7 years ago still remain live? And if they're not even live in their original form, continue to be obfuscated in a certain way that the basic antivirus technologies that we all rely on really can't see stuff anyway. Right? So that's pretty much everyone who's not raising their hands. Right? So that's the very unique challenge about if we have 1 trillion connected devices with endless compute power and the ability to consider everything about our lives as human beings, that's kind of scary. Right? So in some ways, that's maybe what an IoT winter could be. So I want to take another step back. There should be audio and video on the next slide, assuming Windows 10 works very well. Right? And this is sort of a different story, which is, anybody track that amazing story about Strava Fitbit in the US military? Yeah? Right? So for those who didn't raise their hands, there's a little bit of video that's going to play, and it provides perhaps a different view on what an IoT winter could potentially be. Video starts, audio kicks in, and...
Strava is an app and social network that connects with devices like Fitbit and is used to log workouts. It's popular with US soldiers and others stationed abroad, and the Pentagon has distributed several thousand of them to its personnel. They use it to track their exercise routines and everyday activities, like walks or patrols. But it also tracks users' locations, and in November 2017, the company updated a map showing over 1 billion activities and 3 trillion GPS points. 20-year-old international security student Nathan Rooser was the first to point out how Strava's map could compromise operational security. The map alone doesn't show the complete picture, and its satellite images are outdated, but it does tell you where to look. So by combining it with recent satellite imagery and other reporting, we get a clearer sense of what's happening on the ground. Take this new US Air Force base in Sarin, Syria. The map shows workouts or walking routes, activities that provide a clear blueprint of the base. And by tracing the lines, we can follow soldiers to a newly set up helicopter pad. Here's what else we found. A new compound at a French military site in Mali. Strava highlighted the camp in the first place, and no other mapping platforms had marked the site. These US forward operating bases in Afghanistan, the location of a US drone base under construction in Agadez, Niger, and various military facilities in Djibouti, where the US is fighting extremist groups in the Horn of Africa. And there are some mysterious sites that we can't yet identify. An area in the middle of the Nigerian desert, 2 remote locations surrounded by sand barriers in Yemen, and here's unusual activity in the desert in Mauritania that led us to a suspected military site, including an extended airstrip nearby.
So I think a fair statement. Let's all go for the not good vote on what the outcome of that would be. Okay?
But what's so special about it?
What's so special about it? Like,
I mean,
that's not necessarily so
years
new.
ago you had people using applications on their phones. I'm talking about military that provided geotagging on photographs. Okay, this is just another rehash, although probably a little bit more intense. But we've been having this problem for a while.
I think the main difference is, in order for someone years ago to have validated that in fact there was someone there, at some point in time you had to have someone with a pair of binoculars looking out and saying, yep, I see the person, rather than a 20-year-old sitting in Australia taking code and just uploading it to the web and then being able to exactly pinpoint the location of not one person or 2 people without having to hack into the geolocation system of the telcos and then triangulate based on multiple cell towers. Here, it's just a straight-up upload to the cloud of geolocation, and then someone logging on and using all available systems. Nothing, the person used here, they didn't break into anything. It was all publicly available information.
Right. But
Yeah.
I'm talking about
Yes, there's
soldiers
no doubt.
posting photos
Yes,
on social media. There's no hacking there.
that's true. There's no hacking there,
With
right?
geotagging.
Yes, agree, right? So this is, I think there's a pre-identification of areas and the scope that becomes challenging. And in fact, that's really the main point that I wanted to touch on of taking a look at this, is that it's not so much that this stuff is brand new. It's more a question of what is the fundamental difference. And the direction that I would suggest would be that it's scale. What becomes fundamentally different about this sort of an issue within the context of Internet of Things is the scale that the threat represents, the scale of the resource power behind it. And then when you think about the scale and the capacity, what new outcomes and risk could you possibly see? Right, so that's sort of the direction where I was heading. Right, and so another very interesting example, who here went ahead and bought skin underwear? Okay, right, so Skin Underwear has this amazingly secure system that has built-in compute power into underwear, and if you wanted to, you could share your body temperature, your pulse, your general behavior, nearly everything about that you do on a day-to-day basis tied to sensors that feel your body functions. Right, so that's a scale thing that might be different than just a geolocation update on in social media. We regularly do research as a company. I'm at Checkpoint on various vulnerabilities. Two very bizarre stories wrapped into this one about Okiru and Satori. None of the stuff that's on this slide is new. TR64 is a protocol that ISPs have been using for years on routers in order to run general health and diagnostics and push updates and stuff. It's sort of a regular management protocol. There have been vulnerabilities announced on TR064 for years upon years upon years, and they continue not to be patched specifically well. Kind of interesting challenge number one. The next component of this specific vulnerability is you'll notice that it refers to Mirai. Mirai, up until sort of end of 2016, was viewed as everyone's worst case scenario for an Internet of Things attack, until the reportage on the subject finally pointed to the fact that it in fact was people messing with Minecraft games. So people were using available servers and leveraging vulnerabilities, at least in terms of basic passwords, in order to gain access to a whole bunch of video cameras and then target traffic to take down people who maintained Minecraft servers because they wanted to take their competition offline so that users would only go to their Minecraft servers. Right? So nothing new necessarily within these attack vectors, except for the point that the level of connectivity, the number of devices is skyrocketing, and the fact that these vulnerabilities and attack vectors continue to be useful. Because this stuff is new variants of the same. And over time, what we've seen is that the types of vulnerabilities that people are exploiting aren't problems in basic configuration, rather they're targeted exploits on specific vulnerabilities in the platforms themselves. And that opens up a level of potential maliciousness that indeed becomes even harder to overcome, especially considering scale. So for those of us in this room who are in a technical capacity, I did a quick count, there are probably about 100 light bulbs in this room. So sort of multiply that across the total number of rooms in this building and try to imagine that while you're updating all the Windows servers and Windows desktops and Apple machines, because they actually do have issues, you then also need to start considering the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of devices that in fact are internet connected. Okay, and the one thing I didn't include on that slide is that the cell phone that probably had the issue that had to be updated, and when the CEO went crazy, was probably also eaten by the dog and somehow got pooped into the same mix as well. Okay, but that's, I think, the scale challenge that really starts to become fundamental. Right, the light bulbs. Who here has Philips Hue at home? Did anyone try to surprise their kids heading into Halloween and see if you could use one of the little apps to mess with the hue colors and tie it to music like I did, only to find out that Philips released a patch to the firmware of the light bulbs not long before Halloween? The firmware of the light bulbs. And if you read the notes, it says, oh, don't worry, over the next 10 to 15 minutes, the light bulbs might turn off and on if you install them in your internal stairways where there's no sunlight. Okay? So there is, let's say, a scale challenge. Not new, but a scale challenge. And I wanted to kind of go through a little bit of an old school sort of a thought process to consider what we might want to do within this sort of a scale issue. All right, so if anyone here used to work with risk management matrices, there's music in the next slide. The music is timed to wake you up in case you might be falling into that pre-lunch slumber. Okay, so it's music plus animation tied to a risk management matrix to harken back to old school themes. So it's an IoT winter risk matrix. The point is, annoyingly so, those of us who work in the IT security business understand that at some point in time we have to ask ourselves some questions like, what do we really care about? What are the things we actually have to focus on if we were to try to secure an IoT winter? And I have 5 minutes left to go through 75 slides, and I'm going to do it. Okay? The first thing, as much as we would love that to be the main issue, right, we're going to get rid of the dancing robots. We're all good with that? Not necessary. Okay. Number 2, we're all making money on things like Bitcoin mining, so let's take that off the table as well. Identity theft, it's terrible. When it happens to us, it's super duper bad. If we're an IT administrator, however, we're going to take it off the table. And that sucks. That's the reality. The next thing, are we going to worry about, I forgot, an internet-crushing DDoS? Also, no. All right, so unless we are Netflix, if we are a SMB or if we're a relatively medium-sized company, we're not necessarily going to be concerned today with our individual given jobs about the internet coming down. Nation-state infrastructure attack also, if some country is going to go after us, they're going to win. So let's unfortunately remove that. All right? So where that leaves us is, unfortunately, for the most part, a pretty vanilla-flavored set of issues that we have to deal with in a given day anyway. And because the GDPR limitations or penalties are coming on May 25th, the possibility of us getting fired because of credential loss of our customers or because of mass issues associated with customer identity theft and other sorts of things, okay, I took that off the table, but anyway, right, let's still try to focus on some of these main security challenges. The only way to deal with this sort of thing, as boring as it might sound, is to go back to the whiteboard and start going through a regular standard security architecture, as frustrating as that might sound. And the way that we would try to suggest that that happen is, again, to think about segmentation, sort of as base step 1. Yes, that means some firewalling, right? And you could certainly start implementing segmentation inside of cloud systems and use ACLs inside of your virtualization provider. But there's no way of getting past any of the need to consider where in the network the Internet of Things connected devices are actually going to be located. Does your light bulb have to connect to Oracle? No. Okay? Do your closed circuit video cameras that are used for the security applications inside of your factories have to gain access to SAP? No. Okay? Should you have them feed from the same Windows distribution system that you use for your desktop management stuff, but instead perhaps rely on a different platform for image management? Yeah. Right? Should they be connected to Active Directory? Probably not. Right? So segmentation becomes a fundamental requirement. The scale, however, of this entire space requires a fundamental rethinking of some of the foundational elements that we have within that segmentation plan. Your existing asset database is probably not going to be big enough to cope with 10 million devices, 1 million of which got connected over the last 3 months, and you have no idea what the MAC addresses are. Right? So are we going to have to come up with some kind of a much more complex distributed authentication system? Probably. Do we as a company necessarily know what that is today? No. But something is going to have to come up. Right? Could we imagine some kind of a blockchain technology set that will allow other systems to validate identity? Yes. Does it become possible within a boring firewall rule set to refer to third-party systems that establish identity and trust and have them update systems? Also, yes. That stuff all exists and works today. It's not necessarily new. Right? So those are the sort of concepts, at least as an industry, that we need to start embracing. But operating in parallel to that, and the previous session absolutely touched on this to some extent, is more of an active defense orientation. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should start hacking somebody who's hacking us, but it means that we absolutely have to get away from a detect orientation approach. It's not going to work. There is no way we'll be able to monitor 1 million connected devices over a 30-second period and then do something about it if some of them get overtaken. Not going to work. If that's the reality that we try to operate in, we will simply be destroyed. As network administrators, it's just not going to work. We have to take a much more proactive, prevent-based approach. There is no reason, unless we're some fantastically organized, beautifully segmented network, where we can actually control post-honeypot identification of an exploit. Not going to happen. The systems will simply be affected. And the spread of the attack will be so fast, they'll start reaching into Windows systems, they'll start collecting credentials, and they'll immediately start to plot themselves elsewhere. The stuff just moves too fast. And with millions of connected devices, the rate and speed and scale, which is what's different, will be even harder to approach. And so what you'll start to see from companies like Checkpoint, and hopefully this advances faster, is ways of embedding some fundamental threat prevention technologies deep into the systems themselves that actually connect. So that means, yes, we're putting threat prevention technology inside vending machines and doing our best not to work with the shady people who actually manage them. It means trying to position inside of crash carts in hospitals the types of threat prevention technologies we would expect to see in the network and those sorts of systems. And where it takes us is to a space where there's a generational shift occurring in our industry. And as security administrators, we also need to dive into a similarly aggressive generational shift in our willingness to implement crazy technologies that are there for prevention. We have to be as innovative and as creative as the people who are going after us to begin with. So if we think about the scope of connected devices, it means that we also need to start considering ways of distributing agents that understand threat prevention, compute agents that understand threat prevention into all of those millions, billions, trillions of connected machines. And for those of us who work in an administrative role, actually touching hands on keyboard, we're going to have to build up the courage to walk into the board suite and say it might actually take longer than 15 microseconds to download the menu from Gabriel Crouture on 42nd Street to figure out if that's where the board's going to have lunch. It might. It might take 20 microseconds and not 15, and that's actually okay. We can wait to find out how long it'll be until the show on the corner of 43rd and 8th opens. That's also okay, because the broader impact of the security challenge is big enough that that's a compromise that we're okay with. So, with that, I'm ending a grand total of 2 minutes late. The main concept of this presentation, to summarize, right, was that there is a fundamental shift taking place. Yes, it's associated with scale, and the types of approaches that we have used successfully around the concept of network security are relevant. It's things like segmentation, it's things like dividing networks, it's things like thinking about authorization and trust and secure connections and connectivity rules. Those are fundamental. But at the same time, we have to become far more aggressive in a threat prevent first orientation that we can distribute absolutely everywhere. Thank you very much. And I don't think I have time for questions up here, but if you have any, I'm going to step over there. Thanks.